the dead have more to teach you than the living. This statement might sound like mystical superstition or morbid fascination, but it actually represents one of Carl Jung's most profound, yet often overlooked, psychological insights. The immense value of conscious dialogue with the ancestral dimensions of the psyche. Tonight, we continue our exploration of Jung's revolutionary psychology by examining his perspective on what might be called ancestral psychology, the living presence of our predecessors in the collective unconscious, and the transformative potential of establishing conscious relationship with this dimension of psychological life. Building on our previous discussions of the shadow, projection, the curse of consciousness, the anima and animus, prophetic dreams, the inflated ego, collective psychology, happiness-seeking, spiritual experience, the unconscious as warning system, synchronicity, social opposition to authenticity, and the dangers of moral dualism, we now turn to a concept that might initially seem superstitious, but actually represents sophisticated psychological understanding. What you'll discover may fundamentally change how you understand your relationship, not just with your personal ancestors, but with the collective inheritance that shapes your psychological life in ways both visible and invisible. And by the end, you'll understand why Jung considered dialogue with the dead not as supernatural communication, but as practical psychological work, essential for both individual development and cultural healing. The living dead, understanding ancestral presence in the psyche. To appreciate Jung's perspective on dialogue with ancestors, we must first understand his radical view of the unconscious, not merely as repository of personal repressions or forgotten memories, but as living psychological reality that transcends individual boundaries. Within this understanding, the ancestors aren't simply memories or historical figures, but active psychological presences that continue to influence both individual and collective life. As Jung wrote in Memories, Dreams, Reflections, the psyche is by no means tabula rasa here, a mere record of present impressions. It is just as much the historical product of the ancestors' experiences, and through the individual, it links back with the ancestral psyche. This ancestral psyche represents not merely abstract inheritance, but living psychological reality that manifests through the individual. Jung recognized that each person emerges not from psychological blank slate, but from centuries of accumulated human experience, carrying within them not just genetic material, but psychological patterns, complexes, and potentials shaped through generations of human development. These ancestral influences operate both personally through specific family lineages and cultural traditions, and collectively through what Jung called archetypes, the universal patterns that structure human experience across cultures and throughout history. Both dimensions create ongoing psychological presence of the ancestors in contemporary life, influencing conscious experience in ways rarely recognized by conventional perspectives. The personal dimension operates through what we might call family unconscious, the specific psychological patterns, unresolved traumas, repressed material, and unlived potentials transmitted through particular lineages. These aren't merely behavioral habits or explicit teachings, but unconscious psychological complexes that shape perception, emotional response, and behavior in ways that often bypass conscious awareness. Consider how certain emotional patterns repeat through generations despite conscious intentions to create different outcomes. Children who never witness their parents' childhood may nonetheless carry the psychological imprint of grandparents' relational dynamics. Family systems theorists recognize these patterns as intergenerational transmission, but Jung understood them more fundamentally as ancestral presence continuing to seek resolution or completion through contemporary psychological life. The collective dimension operates through archetypes, the universal patterns Jung identified as structuring human experience regardless of cultural context. These archetypes don't represent merely abstract ideas, but living psychological realities that carry accumulated human experience across generations. Through these archetypal patterns, the collective wisdom, wounds, and unlived potentials of countless ancestors continue influencing contemporary psychological life. As Jung noted in the Archetypes and the Collective Unconscious, contents of an archetypal character are manifestations of processes in the collective unconscious. They reveal their presence only by means of symbolic pictures and motifs, which appear in dreams or in the unusual attitudes and activities that conscious individuals unconsciously manifest in their behavior. These symbolic pictures and motifs often carry ancestral content-seeking conscious relationship, imagery, figures, or scenarios that represent not just personal unconscious material, but collective human experience accumulated through generations. Dreams featuring ancestors, historical settings, or archetypal figures particularly suggest this transpersonal dimension seeking conscious engagement. Consider Michael, who experienced recurrent dreams featuring an older man in historical clothing creating intricate mechanical devices. These dreams emerged during career transition when his conscious focus remained entirely on contemporary technology and practical decisions. Through active engagement with this dream figure, he discovered both personal connection to great-grandfather who worked as inventor and broader connection to archetypal patterns of creation and problem-solving that transcended his individual circumstances. This example illustrates Jung's understanding that ancestors manifest in contemporary psychological life not merely as memories or historical references, but as living presences carrying wisdom, wounds, and potentials that continue seeking expression and integration. These manifestations don't require literal belief in supernatural communication, but recognition of psychological continuity that transcends conventional boundaries between past and present, individual and collective. As Jung wrote in The Structure and Dynamics of the Psyche, just as the human body represents a whole museum of organs, each with a long evolutionary history behind it, so we should expect to find that the mind is organized in a similar way. It can no more be a product without history than is the body in which it exists. This history lives not just as abstract influence, but as active psychological presence seeking conscious relationship. Relationship, Jung discovered, holds transformative potential for both individual development and collective healing. In our next section, we'll explore the specific psychological value of establishing conscious dialogue with this ancestral dimension. But first, consider this question. How have you experienced ancestral influences in your own psychological life? When have dreams, synchronicities, or unexpected emotional responses suggested connection to psychological patterns that transcend your individual experience? The ancestral dialogue. Why the dead seek communication. Jung's most profound insight about ancestral psychology wasn't simply that past influences shape present experience, but that the ancestral dimension actively seeks conscious relationship, that the dead, psychologically speaking, attempt communication with the living through dreams, synchronicities, symptoms, and creative impulses. Understanding why this communication occurs reveals its importance for both individual and collective psychological health. As Jung wrote in Memories, Dreams, Reflections, the souls of the dead know only what they knew at the moment of death and nothing beyond that. Hence, their endeavor to penetrate into life in order to share in the knowledge of men. This statement reflects Jung's understanding that psychological life continues seeking development even after physical death, not through supernatural persistence, but through the ongoing influence of psychological patterns in the collective unconscious and their manifestation through living individuals. The dead seek relationship with the living because certain psychological processes remain unresolved, certain potentials remain unrealized, and certain wisdom remains unintegrated in ways that continue seeking completion. Jung identified several specific reasons why ancestral dialogue holds such psychological importance. First, unresolved trauma and psychological wounds from previous generations continue seeking healing through contemporary consciousness. The psychological impact of historical events doesn't simply disappear with the death of those who experience them directly. It persists in the collective unconscious, manifesting through individual and cultural psychological patterns until consciously recognized and integrated. This understanding explains the psychological reality behind concepts like ancestral healing in various cultural traditions. From Jung's perspective, these practices don't involve supernatural intervention, but psychological integration of unresolved ancestral material that continues influencing contemporary experience. By consciously engaging this material rather than remaining unconsciously possessed by it, individuals can transform destructive patterns into more integrated psychological functioning. Consider the profound trauma of historical events like slavery, genocide, mass displacement, or prolonged warfare. The psychological impact of these experiences doesn't end with those directly affected, but continues through generations, creating patterns that persist until consciously recognized and transformed. This persistence represents not supernatural curse, but psychological reality requiring conscious relationship for genuine healing. Second, unlived potentials and undeveloped gifts from previous generations continue seeking expression through contemporary psychological life. Jung observed that when important aspects of authentic selfhood remain unexpressed in one generation due to external limitations or internal fears, these potentials don't simply disappear, but persist in the collective unconscious, seeking realization through subsequent generations. This dynamic explains why individuals sometimes experience powerful callings toward particular creative expressions, vocational paths, or life directions that have no obvious precedent in their conscious experience. These callings may represent not merely personal preferences, but ancestral potentials seeking completion, psychological energies that remain active in the collective unconscious until finding conscious expression. Consider Sarah, whose powerful attraction to musical composition emerged despite no family background in music and limited exposure during childhood. Through active imagination with dreams featuring unknown ancestors creating music, she discovered connection to great-grandmother who demonstrated musical talent but abandoned it due to family opposition and practical necessities. Her own musical development represented not merely personal interest, but completion of psychological process that remained unresolved through generations. Third, accumulated wisdom and perspective from previous generations remain available as psychological resource when conscious relationship is established with ancestral dimension. Jung recognized that each generation doesn't begin psychological development from scratch, but builds upon foundations established through countless human lifetimes. This accumulated wisdom remains accessible not through supernatural communication, but through conscious relationship with the collective unconscious. As Jung noted in The Symbolic Life, the unconscious is not a demoniacal monster, but a natural entity, which, as far as moral sense, aesthetic taste, and intellectual judgment go, is completely neutral. It becomes dangerous only when our conscious attitude to it is hopelessly wrong. To the degree that we repress it, its danger increases. This understanding transforms how we might approach ancestral wisdom traditions practiced across cultures worldwide. From Jungian perspective, these traditions don't necessarily involve literal communication with deceased individuals, but psychological engagement with collective wisdom, accumulated through generations of human experience. The ancestors addressed in various cultural practices represent not merely deceased relatives, but psychological connection to transpersonal dimensions of human experience. These three factors, unresolved trauma seeking healing, unlived potential seeking expression, and accumulated wisdom seeking integration, explain why Jung considered dialogue with ancestors psychologically essential rather than merely superstitious. This dialogue serves not supernatural purposes, but practical psychological functions that support both individual development and collective healing. In our next section, we'll explore specific approaches to establishing this dialogue in psychologically grounded ways. But first, consider this question. How might your own psychological life be influenced by unresolved ancestral patterns seeking resolution or unexpressed ancestral potentials seeking realization? When have you experienced callings, recurring patterns, or meaningful coincidences that suggested connection to psychological processes extending beyond your individual experience. The practice of remembrance methods for ancestral dialogue. Jung developed several specific approaches to ancestral dialogue that transform this practice from seemingly supernatural communication to grounded psychological work with profound benefits for both individual development and collective healing. These methods don't require literal belief in supernatural persistence, but recognition of psychological continuity between generations manifesting through the collective unconscious. The first and perhaps most accessible approach involves active engagement with dreams featuring ancestral figures, historical settings, or archetypal patterns suggesting transpersonal dimensions. These dreams provide direct communication from the collective unconscious, often carrying ancestral material, seeking conscious integration. Practice this engagement by paying special attention to dreams featuring known or unknown ancestors, appearing as dream figures, historical settings or periods outside your direct experience, cultural symbols, languages, or practices unfamiliar to your conscious life, archetypal figures that seem to carry historical or collective significance, scenarios involving transmission of knowledge, objects, or guidance. Rather than merely analyzing these dreams intellectually, engage them as living communications through active imagination, artistic expression, journaling, or embodied exploration. Ask questions directly to dream figures. Continue the dream narrative through conscious imagination. Create art expressing the dream's emotional qualities, or physically enact the dream's movements and gestures. This engagement establishes dialogue with ancestral dimensions represented through dream imagery, creating conscious relationship with psychological material that might otherwise remain unconscious influence. Through this dialogue, previously unconscious ancestral patterns can be recognized, integrated, and potentially transformed rather than continuing as unconscious determinants of thought, emotion, and behavior. The second approach involves what Jung called active imagination, conscious engagement with unconscious content through creative dialogue rather than passive reception or intellectual analysis. This practice creates direct communication channel with unconscious dimensions, including ancestral material seeking conscious relationship. Practice active imagination specifically focused on ancestral dialogue by creating internal image of ancestral counsel or specific ancestor figure, posing questions directly to these figures and allowing responses to emerge without conscious direction. Recording dialogue through writing, art, movement, or other expressive forms. Maintaining conscious awareness throughout process while allowing unconscious content authentic expression. Reflecting afterward on insights, guidance, or patterns revealed through dialogue. This practice doesn't assume supernatural communication, but psychological reality of ancestral patterns active within the collective unconscious. By establishing conscious relationship with these patterns through symbolic dialogue, previously unconscious influences can be integrated into more complete psychological functioning. The third approach involves engagement with cultural and family rituals, stories, and artifacts that carry ancestral psychological content. Jung recognized that cultural practices like ancestor veneration, family storytelling traditions, and preservation of ancestral objects serve important psychological functions beyond their literal meanings or social dimensions. Practice this engagement by learning and sharing family stories, particularly across generations, maintaining or creating rituals, acknowledging ancestral influence and presence, preserving meaningful family objects that carry ancestral connection, exploring cultural traditions related to ancestor remembrance, researching family and cultural history with attention to psychological patterns. These practices create containers for ancestral dialogue that integrate personal, unconscious material with broader cultural patterns, establishing conscious relationship with psychological inheritance that shapes individual experience within historical and cultural context. The fourth approach involves what some Jungian analysts call genealogical inquiry, psychological exploration of family patterns across generations with attention to recurring themes, unresolved traumas, and unexpressed potentials. This inquiry goes beyond collection of historical facts to psychological understanding of patterns that persist through generations. Practice genealogical inquiry by creating family tree with attention to psychological patterns and significant events, exploring repeated themes in family narratives across generations, researching historical contexts that shaped ancestral experience, noticing your emotional responses to specific ancestors or family narratives, identifying unresolved traumas or unexpressed potentials that might continue seeking resolution or expression. This inquiry provides context for understanding how specific ancestral patterns might continue influencing contemporary psychological life, creating foundation for more conscious relationship with this inheritance. The fifth approach involves creative expression that draws consciously from ancestral sources while introducing contemporary elements, what Jung might consider psychological vessel for dialogue between past and present. This creativity serves not merely artistic purposes, but psychological function of integrating ancestral material into contemporary consciousness. Practice this creative dialogue through artistic expression, incorporating ancestral symbols, patterns, or themes, writing that explores ancestral perspectives or reimagines historical narratives, music drawing from traditional forms while introducing personal elements, cooking traditional family recipes with conscious attention to their psychological significance, crafts or practical skills connecting to ancestral practices. This creativity establishes dialogue through active engagement that honors ancestral influences while incorporating contemporary consciousness, creating integration that neither fixates in the past nor disconnects from psychological inheritance. These approaches share common psychological foundation, recognition that ancestral influence operates as living presence in contemporary psychological life, and that establishing conscious relationship with this presence creates potential for both individual development and collective healing. They transform ancestral dialogue from seemingly supernatural communication to grounded psychological practice with profound benefits for psychological wholeness. As Jung wrote in Memories, Dreams, Reflections, it is less a question of treating the unconscious as a sort of mind-expanding drug than of experiencing it as an autonomous reality with which we must come to terms. Living with the ancestors, the psychological value of remembrance. We began with a provocative statement. The dead have more to teach you than the living. We've explored Jung's understanding of ancestral presence in the psyche, the reasons why this ancestral dimension seeks conscious relationship, and specific approaches to establishing psychologically grounded dialogue with this dimension. Now we arrive at Jung's most profound insight about ancestral psychology, why this dialogue offers unique value unavailable through other psychological approaches. Jung discovered that conscious relationship with ancestral dimensions creates several specific benefits essential for both individual psychological health and collective cultural healing. Understanding these benefits transforms ancestral dialogue from seemingly archaic practice to sophisticated psychological approach with particular relevance for contemporary challenges. The first benefit involves psychological integration across time. The capacity to experience oneself not as isolated individual existing only in present moment, but as living embodiment of psychological continuity extending through generations. This temporal integration creates what Jung called historical consciousness, awareness of oneself as link in human chain rather than autonomous entity disconnected from historical context. As Jung wrote in The Structure and Dynamics of the Psyche, without history, there can be no psychology. This historical consciousness doesn't create limitation, but psychological foundation that supports authentic individuality. By recognizing yourself as both inheritor and transmitter of psychological patterns extending beyond individual lifetime, you develop more complete self-understanding that includes both personal uniqueness and participation in collective human journey. Consider James, whose persistent sense of disconnection and existential isolation significantly diminished through genealogical research, combined with active imagination dialogue with ancestral figures. The abstract notion that no man is an island became lived psychological reality as he experienced himself as meaningful participant in human continuity extending through generations, not negating his individuality, but grounding it in deeper context that reduced existential alienation. The second benefit involves psychological resources unavailable through purely personal development, connection to wisdom, perspective, and capacities accumulated through countless human lifetimes. Jung recognized that the collective unconscious contains not just problematic material requiring integration, but profound resources supporting psychological growth when conscious relationship is established. This resource dimension explains the psychological reality behind various cultural practices, seeking ancestral guidance or blessing. From Jungian perspective, these practices don't necessarily involve supernatural intervention, but psychological connection to transpersonal wisdom, accumulated through generations of human experience. Wisdom that becomes accessible through conscious relationship with collective unconscious. Consider Elena, whose professional challenges seemed insurmountable until dream featuring grandmother offering specific guidance prompted active imagination dialogue with ancestral feminine figures. Through this dialogue, she accessed problem-solving approaches and resilient strategies developed through generations of women facing similar obstacles. Not supernatural assistance, but psychological connection to collective wisdom previously inaccessible to her conscious perspective. The third benefit involves healing historical trauma that continues influencing contemporary psychological life until consciously recognized and integrated. Jung understood that unresolved psychological wounds don't simply disappear with death of those directly affected, but persist in collective unconscious, manifesting through individual and cultural patterns until conscious relationship transforms their expression. This understanding explains why certain psychological patterns persist through generations, despite conscious intentions to create different outcomes. Without conscious dialogue with ancestral dimensions carrying these patterns, they continue operating as unconscious influences rather than integrated aspects of psychological functioning. Consider Michael, whose persistent anxiety and hypervigilance defied conventional therapeutic approaches until genealogical research revealed ancestral pattern of trauma related to historical persecution. Dreams featuring unknown ancestors fleeing danger led to active imagination dialogue that gradually transformed his relationship with inherited hypervigilance, not eliminating this pattern, but integrating its protective aspects while releasing its limiting dimensions. The fourth benefit involves completing psychological processes left unfinished in previous generations, expressing potentials, developing capacities, or manifesting authentic directions that remained unrealized due to historical limitations or personal fears. Jung observed that these unlived potentials don't simply disappear, but persist in collective unconscious, seeking completion through subsequent generations. This completion process explains why individuals sometimes experience powerful callings toward particular directions that have no obvious precedent in their conscious experience. These callings may represent not merely personal preferences, but ancestral potentials seeking realization, psychological energies that remain active until finding expression through individuals willing to manifest them. Consider Sarah, whose inexplicable attraction to ocean conservation emerged despite urban upbringing with minimal exposure to marine environments. Dreams featuring unknown ancestors dependent on healthy oceans led to research revealing forgotten family connection to coastal communities whose sustainable fishing practices had been displaced by industrial methods. Her conservation work represented not merely personal interest, but completion of psychological processes carrying ancestral values and relationship with natural world seeking contemporary expression. The fifth benefit involves cultural and collective healing through conscious integration of shared historical patterns, particularly important in societies dealing with legacies of historical trauma, oppression, colonization, or cultural disruption. Jung recognized that genuine collective healing requires psychological work that transcends individual therapy to address transpersonal dimensions where historical wounds persist. This collective dimension explains why ancestral dialogue practices remain central to healing approaches in many indigenous and traditional cultures worldwide. These practices address not merely individual symptoms, but collective psychological patterns requiring conscious relationship for genuine transformation. Patterns that continue operating destructively until recognized and integrated at transpersonal levels. Consider how contemporary social issues often reflect unresolved historical patterns seeking conscious integration. Racial tensions carrying legacies of slavery and colonization, environmental destruction reflecting disconnection from ancestral relationship with natural world, or political polarization manifesting historical conflicts that remain psychologically unresolved. Ancestral dialogue practices offer approaches to these collective challenges that address their psychological roots rather than merely their surface manifestations. These benefits explain why Jung considered dialogue with ancestors not as supernatural communication, but as practical psychological work, essential for both individual development and collective healing. This dialogue establishes conscious relationship with psychological inheritance that shapes contemporary experience in ways both visible and invisible, transforming unconscious determination into conscious integration that supports authentic psychological wholeness. As you reflect on tonight's exploration of Jung's perspective on ancestral dialogue, consider this question. How might conscious relationship with the ancestral dimensions of your own psyche support your individual development and participation in collective healing? What unresolved patterns, unexpressed potentials, or accumulated wisdom might be seeking conscious integration through your psychological life? Remember Jung's core insight. The ancestors aren't merely historical figures, but psychological presences active in contemporary life through the collective unconscious. Dialogue with these presences creates not supernatural communication, but conscious relationship with psychological inheritance that shapes individual and collective experience in profound ways. By establishing this relationship, we transform unconscious determination into conscious integration that supports both personal wholeness and cultural healing. This understanding doesn't require literal belief in supernatural persistence, but recognition of psychological continuity that transcends conventional boundaries between past and present, individual and collective. It transforms ancestral dialogue from seemingly archaic superstition to sophisticated psychological practice with particular relevance for contemporary challenges. Practice that honors the profound truth that the dead indeed have much to teach the living. When approached through conscious psychological relationship, rather than either credulous superstition or dismissive skepticism, what ancestral dimensions of your own psyche might be seeking conscious relationship? And how might establishing this relationship transform not just your individual psychological life, but your participation in the broader human journey that extends both backward through countless generations and forward into futures your own life will influence in ways both seen and unseen?